By the way, there's a strange thing that goes on in Europe. I think it does where you are as well, where about half the people say, we don't talk about immigration, and another half say, what are you talking about? We're always talking about immigration. I've often wondered why there's this talking past each other, but one of the feelings I have is that it's because we just don't have the conversation we should be having about immigration. Unfortunately, that's exactly the conversation that you and I are now having. But just to get to that absolutely key foundational point on it, you see, as you say, if somebody wants to come to Europe because they really want to be European, I don't really have any problem with that. I admire that. I like it. And I do know of some people like that. I know of people who so love Britain, of all sorts of races and backgrounds, that they want to be in Britain and they want to be as British, as they think everyone else is, and so on. And then, of course, you have this other thing, which is, there are often polls done of immigrant groups which tend to ask the wrong questions. Things like, how happy are you to be in Britain? Well, surprise, surprise. Most people are very happy. They're very happy to be living in a country where there's a welfare state and where they have, a whole set of freedoms and so on, which allow them to live basically the lives that they want to live. But all the time, of course, we, the publics, have noticed something. And again, this is something which isn't science. I give all sorts of stats in my book, but one of the things I try to do is to explain the thing that we all just sort of noticed and never really talked about, such as this. If it was the case that when people from Pakistan and Bangladesh came and moved into the northern mill towns of Britain, firstly to do labour and then after the jobs had dried up, if they were indeed, as we always pretend, as British as everyone else, then, it just wouldn't be the case that you'd have these towns where basically everyone is dressed for the foothills of Pakistan, and some women are dressed for the Arabian desert, circa, 7th century, and this wouldn't be the case. They would be for better or worse. I wouldn't enforce it, but you would notice that they would be sort of dressing like everyone else, and they'd be going down to the pub, and they'd be failing to turn up to church most weeks, but would go for family weddings and funerals and so on. And it just obviously isn't the case. You just need to travel around any of these towns, and you just notice it's a different culture living in the towns. And some people love that. Obviously, for the people who come, it's very good. And some people are just saddened by it. Saddened because we think, well, you never asked us about this. And we see just a very, very fundamental change to a society that we loved.
Well, and of course, if you wish to experience Middle Eastern culture, there's an entire Middle East you can go and visit. But if you wish to experience quintessentially British culture, it seems like it's a bit of a shrinking geography these days, because, of course, if people want to live in Arabic or Muslim countries, or if they want to go and live in Pakistan, they can. But as you point out at the beginning of the book, Europeans have no other place to call home.
Yes, this is the central, as it were, pain in all of this, is that Europe, in this weird thing of deciding that Europe is the home for anyone in the world who wants to move in and call it home, ends up taking away the only home the European peoples have. I say at one point in the book, we talk forever about the rights and the duties we might owe people coming into Europe. And I've traveled all around, the places, the reception points, the places where people come in. I've spoken to the people literally just off the boats, seen them come in. And, the thing is about this is that we talk about the boats of the people coming in. But I say toward the end of the book, what if this is our boat? And what if the discussion we've been having, which presumes that this boat of Europe is a vast cruise liner that can just keep on taking on people on board that it finds in the oceans around it. But if instead of that being the case, we're actually ourselves a rather smaller and more volatile vessel, more vulnerable vessel, and that we actually keep taking people on board, and at some point the whole thing capsizes. And capsizes, as I say, the only thing we have to call a vessel which is our home.
It is a chilling thought where this kind of stuff can lead. And the other thing I think regarding the welfare state is integration is, I guess, was the original idea. I mean, if everyone had been told at the beginning, well, we're going to bring people in from the third world, we're going to pay them to set up their own communities, and then they're going to try and set up parallel legal systems, and then they're going to do this, and your tax bill is going to go up enormously, and it's going to be hard for you to find housing, and your housing is going to be very expensive, and there's going to be lots of problems for your kids in schools, and violence and criminal. If this was all told, of course, nobody would vote for it, but of course, it never is told that way, and even the people who frame it may not have the information or the foresight to see where it's going to go. But in the presence of the welfare state, it seems that the incentive to integrate becomes diminished to the point of virtually being non-existent. Like if I go to Japan with $1,000 in my pocket and intend to stay for a couple of years, I'm going to have to adapt to the local customs. If I don't learn anything about the local customs or learn anything about the local language, it's going to be very hard for me to make a go of it in that society. And this is another thing, of course, in the 19th century when people came to America, they had to learn English, they had to adapt to local customs, they were subject to the same laws and so on. But if you pay people the welfare state, you're basically building an economic moat around them that they can perfectly well survive and flourish, indeed, in your society without adopting any of the mainstream values.
Yeah, and I mean, by the way, the example you give of housing prices and things is amazing thing. In Britain, we need to build about 300,000 new homes a year. Something we really keep failing to do. And I mean, you basically got to build a city nearly the size of Liverpool every 18 months or every year or so. And we keep failing to do it. And it's the reason why actually young people in Britain find it incredibly hard to get on the property ladder. It's incredibly expensive to buy property in the UK. And almost nobody ever mentions that 300,000 is pretty much exactly the net immigration figures into Britain in an average year. I mean, you know, who'd have guessed that people moving into Britain would need somewhere to live? I mean,
but the climate is so balmy, right? And they just tent on the beaches. Yeah.
I mean, it's also this, by the way, and just going back to that point you made about the nobody expecting the integration or you know, demanding it. It's so much worse than that, isn't it? Because as I say at one point in the book, go back to 5 years before Angela Merkel opened the borders of Europe to the world officially. Go back 5 years before that to a speech that Angela Merkel made in Potsdam in 2010. Famous speech at the time in which she declared that multiculturalism had failed, utterly failed was her term. I go into this in some depth in the book. It's a thing that fascinated me at the time. It made headlines around the world when she said it. One of the things, by the way, apart from the fact that isn't it bonkers that you would say that a thing had failed and then 5 years later massively ramp up the thing that had caused the failure in the first place. But just to go back to that initial point, the interesting thing about that 2010 Merkel speech is that in it she said something else which was extraordinary. She said, we had expected the guest workers to go home. That in the 1950s, when Germany invited Turkish and other guest workers in to help rebuild the country, and it wasn't just that one speech, we know this from all sorts of other sources, German authorities and others didn't expect the migrants to stay. The expectation was that they would do the job and then return home. Of course, you know, who would blame anyone? You invite them into your country. If you're a young man with a job, you've also got a wife, you bring in your wife, and if you're with your wife, you're very likely to do things that might lead to children, and then once you have children, they're going to need to go to school. All of this is totally predictable. But nobody did predict it. So then when everyone has the integration argument, we forget that we never expected to get to the stage where you were talking about integration. And then once we did, we didn't know whether we wanted integration or not. I mean, there's a whole set of things that happened. It was a long period in Europe over recent decades where actually we didn't particularly encourage people to integrate, quite the opposite.
Well, that's the whole point of diversity or integration. You can only pick one in the long run.
Yeah, and we sort of went back and forwards for a bit, and currently we say we're about integration, but really there's no evidence we are. I mean, look, let's face it, Angela Merkel now says that people who come to live in Germany should learn to speak German. I mean, wow. After all of these decades, I mean, that's the demand. And by the way, what happens, Miss Merkel, what happens if they say, no, they're not particularly inclined to speak German? What are you going to do then? Nothing.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.